This is a production of the Central American Cacao Project of CATIE, Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center, and the World Cocoa Foundation.
Sexual reproduction of cacao. Cacao is a tree that reproduces itself sexually, like the people and animals on our farms. This means that a male and a female must join together to create a seed, which, when it germinates, produces a new cacao plant.
In cacao trees, the male and female parts are found on the same flower. The flowers grow in clusters on the trunk and on the main branches of the tree. The swellings on the trunk and branches from which the flower emerge are known as flower cushions.
These cushions must be treated with great care. If they are damaged, they will not produce any more flowers. And without flowers, there will be no more fruits or pods. And without pods, there will be no more cacao. To protect the flowers, we must follow some basic advice on how to care for the flower cushions.
First of all, when harvesting the ripe cacao fruits or pods, we must cut them off with a knife or pruning shears as close to the fruit as possible. If we remove the fruits by pulling or twisting it, the flower cushion will be permanently damaged.
Second, when pruning the trees, we must be careful not to scrape the branches or the trunk with the machete to avoid damaging the flower cushions. Pruning should be done after the main harvest. By pruning the trees, we allow more light to enter, thereby encouraging flowering.
And third, if we need to climb the cacao tree, let's try to avoid stepping on or damaging the flower cushions.
We have mentioned that in cacao plants, the male and female parts are found in each flower. Therefore, in order to learn how to reproduce cacao by seed, the first thing we must do is to learn more about the flower, its different parts, and what each part is for.
As we can see, the cacao flower is joined to the trunk by a little stem called a pedicel, through which the flower obtains nourishment from the tree.
Before opening the flower is a closed bud and is called the flower bud. It takes 30 days to open and become a flower. The flower begins to open at night, and by dawn, it is already completely open, ready for reproduction.
Once the flower is open, we can see 5 small leaflets called sepals, which protect the flower before it opens.
Above the sepals, we find 5 petals, which attract insects with their bright colors.
Later on, we will see why insects are so important.
Following on from the petals, we find the staminoids. These are 5 elongated filaments like little needles, usually of a reddish color, which also serve to attract insects. After the staminoids, we find the stamens, which are like little stalks with a small sac at the tip called the anther.
Inside the anther, there are the pollen grains, small, hairy, sticky balls that are very hard to see with the naked eye. The pollen grains are the male part of the flower.
The center of the flower contains the ovary, a little round sac containing the ovules. This is the female part of the flower. A slender little tube emerges from the ovary called a style, which becomes wider at the tip. The tip of the style is called the stigma.
Let's see how the male and female parts join together in the cacao flower.
As in animals and humans, in cacao, a male must unite with a female to produce a seed that will give rise to a new tree. We know that in cacao plants, the male part is the pollen, and the female part is the ovule. When the pollen joins with the ovule, fertilization takes place, producing a seed.
Pollination is the journey made by the male's pollen to the female's style or stigma, so that it can then penetrate the ovary and fertilize the ovule. Fertilization occurs when the pollen joins with the ovule and produces a seed.
But how do the pollen grains reach the ovule?
We mentioned previously that the petals and staminodes of the cacao flowers, with their attractive colors, aromas, and nectar, attract midges. When these tiny insects walk on the flowers, They transfer the pollen to the stigma and style of the flower.
The pollinating midges visit many flowers on the same tree or on several neighboring trees. When the midge reaches a flower, it walks on it in search of a delicious, sweet liquid called nectar. As it moves about, the midge comes into contact with the anthers, where the pollen grains are, and, as these are sticky, they get stuck on its feet and body.
Some pollen grains fall off the midge and become stuck to the style and stigma, penetrating the ovary and fertilizing the ovules. The union of an ovule with a pollen grain produces a seed.
A fruit contains between 30 and 50 seeds. This means that between 30 and 50 pollen grains join together with an equal number of ovules.
Once the ovules have been fertilized, the ovary begins to grow to make room for the seeds. This ovary becomes the cacao pod.
It is important to understand that because of the midge's movement from one tree to another, all the seeds in a particular fruit have the same mother, but the pollen, in other words, the father, may either come from the same flower or from another flower on the same tree, or even from flowers on neighboring trees. Therefore, the seeds within a same pod may have different fathers.
Because cacao pollinating midges are very small and do not travel far, barely 10 meters, the fathers of the seeds will be found in the vicinity of the mother plant.
It is important to know where and how these pollinating midges live to see what cacao farmers can do to increase pollination in the cacao grove. The pollinating midge lays its eggs in the water. The eggs remain there for 3 days, after which time a small, worm-like creature called a larva emerges from each egg.
The larvae live for about 12 days and then become enveloped by a kind of silky material and form a cocoon called a pupa. They remain here for another 3 days until they finally emerge as adult midges.
Adult midges can fly, mate between males and females, and lay more eggs in order to reproduce. The more midges there are in a cacao plantation, the more flowers can be pollinated to produce more cacao fruits and seeds.
Midges are active in the early hours of the morning, approximately from 6 to 10, and toward the end of the afternoon, when there is not much sun and the air is cooler. Cacao-producing families can help the midges by following some tips.
First, we should know that midges like to live in damp, humid environments. For example, among the plants that grow on the branches of cacao and shade trees, and that accumulate rainwater, such as bromeliads.
That's why it's important to use regulated shade in the cacao plantation and maintain a good layer of leaf lifter on the ground, so that the midges can lay their eggs and larvae can develop. Second, after harvesting bananas or plantains, we can cut their stems into disc-shaped slices and distribute these near the cacao trees to provide places where the midges can grow and reproduce.
Now let's think about this. If we already know about the cacao flower and know where the male and female parts are and how to transfer the pollen to the style and stigma of the female flower, then we ourselves can pollinate the flowers instead of leaving that work to the midges. This means we can produce our own seeds using fathers and mothers selected for their high production, resistance to disease, or some other desirable characteristic.
We can also pollinate manually in order to obtain more pods and boost our cacao production.
Once we have chosen the father and mother trees, we pick newly opened flower from the father and very carefully, using tweezers, we remove the petals to reveal the anthers, the little sacs where the pollen is stored.
We take the male flower, without petals, to the mother flower, and very carefully, using the same tweezers, we remove the staminoids to reveal the style and the stigma, and then rub the anthers of the father flower to the stigma and style of the mother flower so that the pollen grains stick to it, penetrate the ovary, and fertilize the ovules. Finally, we cover the pollinated flower to prevent midges arriving with pollen from other trees.
5 days after having pollinated the flower, we check to see if a fruit has begun to form. If the flower dries up or falls off, it means that the pollination failed.
Manual pollination may be done from 6 to 10 in the morning as the stigma is more receptive at this time of day and there is greater pollen viability.
Many cacao plantations are unproductive. Low production may be due to several factors. First of all, there may be few pollinators in the cacao grove. However, we have already seen how to increase the populations of pollinating midges and how we ourselves can pollinate the cacao.
Second, it may be that some mother trees do not accept their own pollen or that of certain father trees.
If the pollen does not fertilize the flowers on the same tree, we say it is an auto-incompatible tree. To produce fruits, their flowers must be pollinated with other trees.
If the male can fertilize the flowers from the same tree, we say that it is an autocompatible tree.
Third, there may be a lot of variability among the trees in the cacao plantation. Variability occurs because when the male and female join together, the offspring, in other words, the seeds, although similar, will differ from each other.
For example, some trees are more productive than others. The colors of the pods are different. Some have large seeds and others have smaller seeds. Some take less time to produce their first harvest or are more resistant to diseases.
Variability even occurs in cacao trees that come from seeds of the same fruit and have the same father, just as in siblings within the same family.
Let's not forget that not only the good traits are inherited, also the bad ones. For example, a cacao tree may transmit vulnerability to diseases such as Manila or black pot to its offspring.
We can reduce variability by selecting the best trees and reproducing these by grafting. We can avoid incompatibility by planting trees that are auto-compatible and compatible with each other.
And because we know how to pollinate cacao manually, we also can determine whether a tree that does not produce fruits is auto-incompatible and incompatible with its neighbors. If this is the case, we should replace a tree that does not produce fruits with another that is compatible with its neighbors.
Fourth, a lack of maintenance in our cacao plantations may be responsible for the low production of cacao trees. Farming families should organize themselves and work hard to prune trees, regulate the shade, and regulate pests, diseased branches, and weeds that reduce the cacao harvest.
Now, let's hear a summary of the topics we have discussed so that we are in no doubt about how to improve our cacao plantations. When cutting the cob while we are pruning, we need to be careful with the machete and the scissors to avoid damaging the flower stalks.
Midges are essential to improve production. In order to increase their number, we should keep the high levels of humidity by putting banana stems over the falling leaves on the ground.
We also need to be careful when pollinating. We should use tweezers to remove the petals and staminoids and then cover the flower, once pollinated, to prevent other files from reaching it.
Farming families need to work hard and provide appropriate maintenance to cocoa plantations because it will result in better quality cocoa.
On our next installments, we'll learn how farmers can identify and select the best cocoa trees to reproduce them with non-sexual, seedless techniques such as grafting.
See you soon!